Then I'll just throw it. Oh, there you go.
I just got it. Thank you. Your directions are perfect.
We're in business. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. This is really a wonderful opportunity to hear from a great colleague of ours, Dr. Michael Karp. Um, Professor Karp, after double majoring in history and religious studies at Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly, Humboldt, a fellow Cal State, he earned his MA and PhD in history at St. Louis University. His research draws on many subfields, but the social and environmental history of the American West are his main area of focus, and that'll be the topic of today's discussion. Professor Karp's first book, Raising the Redwood Curtain, Labor, Landscapes, and Community Violence in a Pacific Littoral. It examines how the spread of global capitalism violently reordered labor patterns and social relations in Northwestern California. His newest research project seeks to explore how access to water has structured race and class inequalities in California's Colorado desert. Since earning his PhD, he's had the unique privilege to teach in a variety of settings, including in independent middle school, public high schools, dual enrollment programs, and community colleges and universities. His diverse teaching experience has also led to his involvement and interest in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And this is one of his passions for working with future teachers, as we've all learned to appreciate here in the history department. He is situated out at our Palm Desert campus. And he says, notes that he's excited and thankful each day for the opportunity to work with our students and the larger community. And just before I toss to Professor Karp, I just want to note one of the ringing endorsements of his book from fellow California historian Stacy L. Smith. She notes of Raising the Redwood Curtain, Michael Karp expertly blends environmental history, labor history, and the history of race to reveal how diverse people's working relationships with the landscapes of California's northwestern redwood country transformed patterns of global economic exchange, migration, class conflict, and intergenerational racial violence. His extensive research and sharp analysis demonstrate that this little-known region, often dismissed as an isolated rural backwater, was essential to the construction of the U.S. settler colonial state and to the expansion of capitalism across the Pacific world. We have an excellent roster of attendees there already, so I'm going to toss to Professor Karp. Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing your work today.
Thank you so much, Professor Murray. And I also owe you a very big thanks for helping encourage me to do this book talk and being supportive to make it happen. So just many, many thanks to you, especially for how busy you are doing so many other different workshops right now for the department. Just big, big thanks. So happy to be here. I'm also really just overjoyed and honored to have such a great group here. Lots of familiar, I don't have faces, I guess, on Zoom, but names. So it's great to see you all here, colleagues here as well. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today to hear about the kind of research I'm going to share, how I got interested in the research, some of the things that I argue in the book. And hopefully we'll have a good chunk of time at the end for discussion. So hopefully we're able to have some dialogue towards the end. Um, so to get started, I wanted to just talk about how my undergraduate experience led me to this research. So as Professor Murray noted, I'm also a CSU grad. I went to Humboldt State University. If you know anything about Humboldt or Humboldt County, it's just typically associated, of course, with marijuana. That's its big thing, right? Being part of the Emerald Triangle, up there in the Redwood Forest. My experience there, I went when I first started as an undergrad, I was thinking that I wanted to teach high school, and that's what I started out doing. Came to love college and ended up deciding to double major in history and religious studies, and had some faculty along the way encourage me to go to graduate school, which was not something that was immediately on my radar when I started. And was looking toward graduate school, didn't really know what it was entirely I wanted to study. But there were some things as my time as an undergraduate that caught my attention, even though studying Humboldt County was definitely not on my radar as I was nearing graduation, as I was preparing to go off to graduate school. I thought I was going to study the American Revolution, was kind of the area that I was excited about at the time. It's what my senior capstone paper was on. But when I was an undergraduate, one of the things that kind of came up frequently was some of the very difficult histories, local histories, and in particular, one of the things that was talked about a lot and was made apparent to the local community because of the activism of the Wiyot tribe was the Indian Island Massacre, which was the subject of my master's thesis. It's about the first third of the book, deals with the history surrounding this massacre, which I'll talk more about. But the Wiyot started gathering in the early 90s after they gained federal recognition to memorialize the tribal members that were killed during this massacre. And it was something that's open just generally to the community in Eureka, Arcata, the Humboldt County area. And it was something that piqued my interest in the region's history, because it was something that hadn't been really studied as much, especially if there's a great deal of scholarship on massacres like Wounded Knee and Sand Creek, and others, right? That maybe even show up in your U.S. history survey classes. This one, though, was not, right? So I was very interested in that, and also the compelling activism that the tribe was carrying out. And then another thing happened as well, and this was during my very final semester at Humboldt. I read William Cronin's Changes in the Land for a Colonial and Revolutionary America class that I was taking, um, and absolutely loved it. It was ironically a book that my mom had wanted me to read when I started out college, and I don't think I didn't ever get around to it, and should have, because it completely like made me excited about history in a way that I didn't anticipate. And what happened was I read the book. It's one of the books that literally kind of founded environmental history. And I thought one day I was sitting at the top of this hill at Humboldt, at Founders Hall, like looking out over Humboldt Bay, and I was thinking you could write a book kind of like that about this area. And it was just a sort of passing thought because I was heading off to go study the American Revolution and whatnot. Um, and then to make a very long story short, because it is a longer story, I don't need to tell today. When I got to graduate school, I ended up meeting the woman who became my advisor. I switched to study the U.S. West and environmental history in my first semester. But that seed basically was planted that very last semester. Why I wanted to share that today, and just seeing some of the students that are here today, I know are interested in heading off to graduate school or interested in PhD programs, um, is it can be hard to know sometimes when you are an undergraduate, are the things that I want to study something that can contribute to the field or something that's going to work down the road. And I think that you should trust your gut on that. You could have ideas right now that, of course, like any research project, they'll change and evolve and things like that. But things that you're interested in, pursue those passions because you never know. I literally had no idea when I had that thought that passing day that it would evolve into a book project someday. So trust in those types of things. Like I said, trust your gut as well. So to move forward to kind of the research question itself. So I had gotten interested in the subject because of, like I said, the activism of the tribe and the Indian Island Massacre of 1860, which was, by the way, it was a group of Euro-Americans killed at least 188 Wiyot, mostly women and children with axes and hatchets. The numbers for these types of things vary. We know that it was at least 188 people because the military conducted a body count after it, but it could have been perhaps as much as 350 people or more. And so the first third of the book was trying to understand, obviously, why did this massacre happen? How did it fit into these larger contexts of the U.S. West and the gold rush and settlement and all of that? And then I was looking into the county a little bit more, and this came up sometimes as well as an undergrad that the communities in Humboldt, and actually ended up being the entire county, also carried out one of the longest running anti-Asian campaigns in U.S. history, which began with the expulsion of Chinese immigrants from Eureka in 1885, and came to an end finally in 1906 with the expulsion of some Chinese and Japanese workers that had tried to come into the county. And so obviously that stuck out as I started looking in the county. And then in graduate school, I read another book, Killing for Coal by Thomas Andrews, which is kind of Changes in the Land. And then Thomas Andrews's book were kind of the thing that solidified I could do a dissertation on this history. Thomas Andrews looks at the coal industry in Colorado. It's an environmental and labor history, and he looks at how these deeper environmental histories led to the chaos of the Ludlow massacre and the strike that was surrounding it. And I found that there was this strike in Humboldt County in 1935 that ended in bloodshed, where the police ended up shooting into the crowd. The strikers retaliated and fought back against the police. And so I had these three events, and I knew I wanted to somehow write a history of this region. And for some reason, at the outset, I thought there's got to be a way that these things are connected. How can I connect these three events? This was something that I was like, spent many years trying to do. And I always remember kind of early on in the process, I was talking with my advisor about it, and we were talking. She's like, "Yeah, this definitely seems like you could do a dissertation on it." But she said, you're looking at these three different things. It sounds like you're trying to write three mini dissertations. This doesn't seem like there's a unified story here, except that it all just took place in the same place. And this became the most challenging part of the project. Was one, why look at Humboldt County? What is the larger significance of this what really is this kind of very rural, isolated place still today? Um, and are these events connected or not? And it even became kind of the a joke among my peers in graduate school that was the Michael Karp thing to do, was try to connect these disparate things and show the connections between them, because I did it with other stuff too, so maybe it is my thing. So anyway, that was the big kind of question that I started with, and now I'm going to talk about how I finally came to tying them all together. So, just gonna start off with, this is just on page one, what ended up being the central part of my argument. So the central thesis of this book is that shifting land use practices and exploitative labor patterns spurred by the colonial settlement of the Pacific world provide a through line with which to examine the root causes of the genocide of California's native people, the region's anti-Chinese campaigns, and the oppression of Eastern European immigrant workers in Humboldt County, California. And I'll get into the specifics of this, but what I would argue is that the way that people ended up laboring and living in Northwestern California spread out into social violence over time. And I'll start with the gold rush, with settlers bringing in cattle, creating competing labor patterns, especially in the region's limited grasslands, that led to the genocide of native peoples. And again, I'll talk about some of those specifics. And then the redwood industry itself, extremely violent, exploitative industry, where people were getting injured and dying all the time on the job, created a context for larger social violence. And so to add on to that, I argue that in doing so, it examines how labor patterns and global economic developments connected acts of racial violence across time. So that's the kind of like bigger, larger connections that I make. And I make some very specific arguments about the spread of capitalism and about the spread of the colonial settlement of the Pacific Basin created the social and economic conditions that led to all of this exploitation and violence taking place in California itself. So how did I end up doing that? So I'd mentioned Thomas Andrews' Killing for Coal. One of the ways that I have made this argument is that he proposes this idea of a workscape. And in his analysis of coal mining in Colorado, he talks about how coal mining also incredibly dangerous occupation. People are risking their lives every time that they were engaged in extracting coal from the mountainsides of Colorado. And that day-to-day violence, again, shaped how workers interacted with each other, how they interacted with company owners, and it led to the bloodshed that ended up being the end of the Ludlow massacre in Colorado. Um, I took that concept and applied it to looking at indigenous people's workscapes. And a workscape is looking at essentially how people's day-to-day labors shape how they understand the world around them, and also looking at how those labors uh, change people as individuals, how it affects larger society. And it's something, it can feel abstract, but if you think about it on a day-to-day basis, whatever it is that you do for work or how you spend your days really kind of defines your interactions with the natural world. So, for example, I drive a car and sit on a computer all day. Um, which means I'm very detached from the natural world. And I use up a great deal of energy day to day, right? My existence is unfortunately reliant upon fossil fuels, cooling down server rooms so that we can all be on Zoom right now, right? And unless you're aware of those abstractions, right, and those connections, those can be lost. But like for redwood workers, they're chopping down trees. They're killing some of the oldest things in the world, watching coworkers die, right? They're in this very violent, extractive day-to-day existence. So the workscape concept. And then the other one is world systems theory. And in particular, I'm arguing that Humboldt County should be studied because we have so much work that focuses on looking at the metropolis, looking at population centers as being the most important. But I make an argument in the book that we also have to study places that are on the periphery, that we have to study hinterlands as well to understand how these larger historical global transformations have affected everybody, and have also affected the environment, right? So that's kind of one of the pushes that I make is that the periphery also matters, and that we need to look at other places like Humboldt County. And then the last piece here as well, and I'll get into some of the specifics of this, is that racism and racial violence are intergenerational. And I was able to, and this was one of those things that ended up being a surprise. I was getting more into the research, is that there's literal direct connections between participants, people who carried out the Indian Island massacre, and people who carried out the Chinese expulsion campaigns, and people who carried out the violence that ended the 1935 lumber strike. And at the same time, on the flip side of it, there are people who are survivors of the Indian Island massacre who ended up down to the present day being those pushing for decolonization. And so part of it is perhaps because Humboldt County is the small isolated place that you have descendants, uh, some people being in the same families participating in these things. But I think it also disturbingly and compellingly does show the ways in which um, racism and racial violence carry forward through generations. It's something that people learn from each other. They learn from their communities. They learn from their parents, right? And so that matters, especially in today's world. We are still trying to navigate larger systemic into institutionalized racism across the board. Looking at histories like this shows us how that stuff continues on. So, the Indian Island Massacre gave you that sort of brief rundown of what it was, and how horrific in nature. So, like I said, there's not anywhere near the amount of scholarship on it that we have on other aspects of genocide being carried out against indigenous peoples. It can't, the massacre itself comes up frequently in California histories, but there's been no systematic treatment of it until my book came out. So that was one of the things that I hope that the book contributes, is having a sort of full history of the causes of it. As far as what other scholars had talked about as some of the causes before my book came out in books like Ben Madley's American Genocide, and also Jack Norton, an indigenous scholar who's writing in the 70s, was really the first to lay the foundation for a lot of work that I feel like unfortunately hasn't been given his due credit. Oftentimes he made a lot of these arguments then, and then have just been kind of repeated by other scholars since then. Um, so one of those in particular that Norton and other people have explored in the decades since is that the federal government in California paid what were called volunteer militias to kill indigenous people. And this is 19th century money, but the state and federal government together allocated almost $1.5 million to reimburse these militias who carried out these killing campaigns against California Indians. And they wrote back just completely. You can go into the California State Archives and see it. They literally write to state officials explaining how many people they murdered, how much food and supplies were expended, and how much money they would need to be reimbursed. And the state decided to actually not only reimburse them, but to also pay them for the work. So they got like wages essentially on top of being reimbursed for the supplies and whatever it was to kill innocent people, who the justification being that indigenous people were harming their cattle, and then they carried out countless massacres indiscriminately. So that'd been a cause that people had looked at for the larger genocide of indigenous people, and it was something that did directly motivate some of the participants in the Indian Island massacre. Like I said, the military conducted an investigation afterward to understand why this had happened. Um, and there were Major Gabriel Rains, who's the person that was carrying out this investigation, had found that some of the people literally thought, well, we can get some money if we go kill these people, right? So that economic aspect was part of it. And again, other people had looked at that. One of the things that I explore that had only sort of been touched upon in was actually Stacy Smith, who generously provided the blurb for my book. Her dissertation talked about it a little bit. It didn't end up making it into her book. And then Mike Magliari, who's a faculty at CSU Chico, had written an article on some of this, was that the massacre itself was tied to conflicts over the enslavement of Native people. So California enters the Union as a free state, but in 1850 passed a piece of legislation called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. And what it really was it was an apprenticeship or an indenture law that allowed settlers to enslave indigenous people. And there was a legal way to do it. There's a legal way to enslave indigenous people, but also an extra legal, full-blown slave trade emerged because of this law in the state of California. Again, sort of minimum estimates historians have put out there's 10 to 20,000 people were enslaved in California at this time. In Humboldt County, there started to be a movement to eradicate slavery, not for humanitarian reasons, but for the belief that indigenous people that had been enslaved were giving arms and ammunition to what they called mountain tribes who were killing cattle. And there emerged a movement to murder, systematically remove enslaved indigenous peoples from settler households. And some of the people that participated in the Indian Island massacre ended up being part of these campaigns to kill enslaved indigenous people who were in white households. And part of the evidence connecting this movement with the massacre is that something like 15 to 16 of the children and infants that were killed the morning of the massacre had white fathers. And some of them in indenture paperwork had been formally indentured to these white men. And that campaign continues for about 2 years after the massacre. And so that was another aspect that I look at. And then the other piece, and again, this is something that had been commented on by other scholars, but it's one that I really bring to the forefront, are the environmental and labor issues caused by livestock. So livestock were brought into prairies that indigenous people had traditionally annually burned, harvested roots and tubers and grasses from. And obviously, the arrival of tens of thousands of cattle disrupted traditional indigenous practices and led to food shortages as well. And so indigenous people started killing cattle either for food or to get them out of these prairies. And settlers responded again with these indiscriminate massacres across the board. Um, and then the last piece of the first kind of three chapters of the book, the final chapter of the covering the history surrounding the Union Island Massacre, is all about that we have to study that people survive genocide. So there had been a handful of recent works that were just focused on indigenous people being victims of genocide. And they're obviously very, very difficult, horrible reads, but there's very little in those books that had recently come out about what happened in the aftermath. How did indigenous people survive and navigate this? And so I have a chapter about how the Wiyot became wage laborers, how they ended up purchasing land that was theirs, of course, but purchased it, rebuilt indigenous communities, and I carry that work into the 20th century. The man who's pictured in the upper left-hand corner here ended up going by Jerry James, and he was actually found in his dead mother's arms the morning of the massacre. And he ended up growing up to be an important Wiyot leader. And his progeny ended up being leaders of the Wiyot tribe down to the very recent present, which I'll talk more about at the end. Um, and so, anyway, a huge part of the book for me was covering not only the causes of genocide and looking at that, but looking at indigenous survival perseverance moving forward. Okay. Now, for the anti-Asian campaigns. So, what were the root causes here? Again, another thing that scholars had looked at that was definitely part of the story for me is that there emerges in the second half of the 19th century a lot of union and labor rhetoric that was driven by white supremacy. You had people like Dennis Kearney in San Francisco calling for the expulsion of all Chinese people, that they needed to have white laborers only. And this becomes a driving force in California politics, not just in labor organizing circles. Um, and this grassroots anti-Chinese sentiment, as I have here, ends up not only shaping California politics, it ends up shaping national politics. Because what happened is, as this all gained steam, you had white workers who argued that Chinese immigrants were what they called often neo-slaves, that they were debt peons that were working for too little of wages, and they were making it impossible for white people to, make a living, and so on and so forth. And California politicians ended up pushing through a series of law, first the Page Law in 1875, but then what's typically just referred to as the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which was the first piece of federal legislation to create this category of an illegal alien, right? It was not a thing until that law had gone pushed through and then solidified in later immigration law. And also the first time that federal legislation had targeted a national ethnic group for immigration restriction. So this is the context in which this is all unfolding, and it's throughout settler newspapers across the board, right? That they're also this anti-Chinese movement is starting to gain steam in Humboldt County. And so obviously I talk a lot about that context. But one of the things that I add to this discussion is looking at the Redwood workscape, which I talked a little bit about already, about how brutal it was and about how the brutality of logging shaped social life. And so what I explore in the book is one is that the redwood industry, even though Humboldt County is this middle of nowhere place, and I don't know how small it is on everyone's screens, or hopefully you can see my cursor, this sort of uh, white circle here, this is Humboldt, and all the red dots here on this map are places that, as of 1893, had become major destinations for the redwood trade. As the Pacific world was colonized, as colonial settlements spread, and especially as capitalism started to, at least, capitalism stemming out from the United States and from Western Europe, the redwood trade expanded with it. So Hawaii becomes a major destination for redwood. Um, Tree port communities in China as well. The Taiping Rebellion causes a need for lumber in China, and redwood companies they start fulfilling these orders. And one of the things that is fascinating that I found is that these trade networks, one, obviously are leading to the devastation of the redwood forest, but secondly, there's literally more than one time I found that there were boats that would leave Humboldt County with redwood, and they would come back with Chinese people, right? These same boats. And so these trade connections are literally also cementing immigration patterns, right? These things are connected. Um, and so looking at kind of all of that in that big picture is a big part of the book. And there's actually even accounts in the newspapers about how well, there's like a frequency of logging accidents that loggers would themselves get into fights and sometimes kill each other, right? It was like sort of even out of the lore of the American West at times that people would get into gunfights and things when the logging industry wasn't doing well, or people were thrown out of work. Lots of heavy drinking, lots of single young men, right? So again, the work violence, the social violence connection. Um, and then there's also some direct ties to the Indian Island massacre as far as why these anti-Asian campaigns take place. So one of them being there's not definitive proof on it, but there is a person who was for sure somebody who carried out genocidal actions against Native people, but is also believed by some early local historians to have been a participant in the Indian Island Massacre. He's on the committee that voted and decided to carry out the first expulsion campaign. The person, though, that led the what was called the Committee of 15, which was the committee that decided to expel the entire Chinese community in Humboldt County, was actually the region's first historian. And he believed that it was a mistake that settlers had not successfully eradicated all indigenous peoples. First book was called The Indian Wars of the Northwest. And he wrote about how settlers should never have created a reservation within the borders of Humboldt County. They should have completely wiped out all indigenous people. And that was a mistake not to be made with the Chinese, right? So the county's history of genocidal violence against indigenous people directly influenced this man whose name was A.J. Bledsoe to support and help carry out the first Chinese expulsion campaign, which then takes off to the extent that they try to expel every single Chinese immigrant in the county. Promotional booster literature in the late 19th century for Humboldt County always had in bold-faced font, the only county in California to not have any Chinese people, right? This is something that the county tries to sell as a positive. Um, and then this carries forward, like I said, until 1906. Again, the Pacific world context is huge here, leading up to the final expulsion. Japan had begun to industrialize, had bested Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. It was something that was the subject again of labor newspapers. There started to be increased Japanese immigration to California, many of them coming from Hawaii at the time. And the labor newspapers of the area were continually talking about Japanese people being a threat. Some Japanese people tried to open a store in Eureka, and it got don't know who did it, but it got dynamited. They blew it up. And then it's in 1906 that some Chinese and Japanese workers were coming to work on a fishery. And what happened is 500 lumber workers walked off the job to protest their presence and force them to leave. Notably, the Chinese and Japanese workers did forced the fishery company to give them the wages that they were promised for the season before they left. But they were forced to leave. Um, and so the union movement continued to operate, really was driven again by white supremacy here. And it ends up costing them, which I'll talk about in the next third of the book here, which is looking at the 1935 lumber strike. So the lumber strike itself, just to give you a quick breakdown of what happened with it, um, it was part of a larger lumber strike in the Pacific Northwest. It started actually in Washington and Oregon, and then finally gets to the Redwood region. And the Redwood strike's not going too well. And at the end of the sort of was like the last ditch effort to keep the strike going. A police officer fired a tear gas canister into the picket line, and it hit one of the only women that were on the picket lines in the chest, and she fell down. And somebody yelled out, "They shot her with a shotgun. Let's get the bastards." And the strikers rushed the police and started beating them with their own nightsticks and pistols. The police panicked and started firing into the picket line. One guy had a machine gun. Fortunately, it jammed after only a few rounds, or otherwise things could have been a lot worse. In the end, three strikers ended up dying, and another over a dozen ended up in the hospital with permanent injuries, as did a handful of police officers. So the question is like, why did the strike end this way in California, in the redwood industry? Because elsewhere in Oregon and Washington, the strike was a success. They got wage increases, they got shorter hours, they won some of the concessions that they were after. And so, in looking at what are the root causes of why it failed, again, the redwood workscape continued to be quite difficult and brutal. You start to have mechanization in the early 20th century, but a lot of the actual like backbreaking labor that was being performed in the 19th century is still has to be carried out. Redwoods, of course, are huge, and and are extremely difficult to process to turn into wood. And so the redwood industry itself continued to be very difficult. It actually, at this time, you start to have some progressive agencies, um, like the Department of Labor, looking into it. It was one of the most dangerous occupations in the United States, and I think it was number two in California. So that's part of it. I make that argument again that this like social violence, the difficulties of the lumber industry bled into how the strike ended up. But again, there's larger context matters. So another one of them is that union efforts, once there is an entirely white-only workforce, it starts to crumble in a lot of ways. And especially actually after the Japanese store got dynamited, lots of the capitalists in the region said, see, we told you these people were dangerous. They're anarchists, and they, use that leverage to start to clamp down on the union movement, and it was effective. They also started to really adopt the tenets of welfare capitalism. They built company towns. And so people working for lumber industries had to live in the company towns. They didn't get paid in money, they got paid in scrip. They had to shop at the company store. They were under constant surveillance. If they were involved with a union or it was found out they were involved with a union, they were blacklisted. They'd have to leave the region. They'd never work there again, right? At any outfit. And so company owners start to clamp down on the union movement big time in the redwood industry, and in ways more effectively than they did so in Oregon and Washington. And then also, what was unique to California was a progressive agency that was all about improving living and working conditions. And the progressives, too, were also really motivated by taking the teeth out of unions. Their thought was, well, if we make living conditions better, we make working conditions better, then people won't have a reason to unionize. And they systematically went through every lumber camp in the region and forced these company owners to make improvements. And it worked. Between welfare capitalists and progressives, uh, working, I would say, kind of unwittingly together, it made it so that there really was not a strong union movement in the redwood industry. Um, and part of the strike as well is that in the aftermath of the strike, Eastern European immigrants were the ones that were blamed for it going wrong at the time. They end up burning the immigrant section of town to the ground in Eureka, and they forced as many Eastern European immigrants as they could onto train cars and shipped them out of the county. So it's essentially like the anti-Chinese purges taking place now against Eastern European immigrants. Um, and I found yet again at the local level connections to the anti-Asian campaigns. One of the members of the committee that was on the anti-Asian campaigns, it was his grandson, who was mayor at the time, that decided to burn the immigrant section of town to the ground. There's like a literal family connection, and there's even at one point an exchange in court when they're trying to determine who's at fault. And he criticizes the lawyers and other people representing these Eastern Europeans as being rank outsiders that will never understand the history of the county and our community and these types of things. Um, and also, his father's steamer was the boat that carried the Chinese literally out of Humboldt County the first time in 1885. So again, there's these like direct family connections, right? As well as these larger uh, national national context, global context as well. Um, okay, so real quick, because I've been talking for too long, which was something I was worried about. um, so Humboldt today, like I said, it's known for the cannabis industry. It really starts to fill the void. The logging industry collapsed. There's only 4% of old growth redwoods exist today. 96% of them are gone. And so I think it's really shows into like a stark relief that because redwood trees take, 2,000 years to reach maturity, it shows into stark relief that our consumption of natural resources really can only go so far. And the past 150 years have been remarkable in terms of how rapidly we have changed the environment. Um, as far as how these things are remembered, the Central Labor Council in Humboldt County, they memorialize the strike every year. It's a big part of what is left of the union movement. By the way, like unionization never takes hold in the redwood industry. California's longest company-owned town, which is Scotia, California, was company-owned until 2011. And the redwood workers tried to go on strike in 1948. They went on strike for 2 years before the strike failed. Um, Trade unionism never takes hold in the county, which is pretty remarkable. Um, Most recently, this was in 2021, a group called the Humboldt Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity have started to work to make plaques in Eureka to one, show the path of where Chinese immigrants were rounded up, forced onto boats. So there's like public history installments that are getting put in, also murals about the Chinese expulsion campaigns, and also too about some of the first Chinese Americans who came back to the region, and because there was laws on the books up until the 1950s that people of Chinese descent couldn't operate their own businesses in Humboldt County. So it's only after World War II that that starts to change. So they're putting that, onto the physical landscape of the county. And then the Wiyot have become known nationally, internationally for their activism. So starting in the 90s, they hold those candlelight vigils to memorialize the massacre, like I was talking about at the beginning. And had a big campaigning to get what was called Indian Island by settlers, with the Wiyot known as Tuluwat, returned back to them. And decades of activism led to first they purchased some of it, and then some of it was given back to them. But finally, in 2019, the city of Eureka voted to give all of their holdings of the island back to the Wiyot, except for one small portion that still is privately owned. And the woman who's pictured here, Cheryl Seidner, She's the great great granddaughter of Jerry James, who is the man that I shared was found in his mother's arms the morning of the massacre. She was central to this campaign for nearly 2 decades, and this is her at the Eureka City Council meeting in which the deed was signed that gave the island back to the Wiyot. The island, by the way, Dulot had been trashed, was full of industrial refuse, and the Wiyot have been hailed for their restoration project. It's been given EPA awards, and indigenous people in northwestern California from the Wiyot to other tribes like the Yurok and others who are helping with the largest dam removal project in U.S. history really underscore. That indigenous stewardship knowledge epistemologies, there's something that we need, that decolonization's possible, it's beneficial for everyone involved. And so anyway, I want to have hopefully some time for questions, so I'm going to stop talking and open the floor for any questions. People can raise their hand, use the chat. And yeah, thank you all.
Thank you, Michael. I want to note a couple of questions here in the chat, and I'll just read them out for you. First, a comment from Jim Fenelon. Jack Norton and I, along with Brendan Lindsay, presented that work in 2014. He's referring back to some of the earlier comments with Cliff Travisser, to which Madley and others responded to in a panel right after ours. Cliff and I presented that argument about genocide in California in an ABS special issue that same year. Thanks. And I have, thanks, Jim, for the comment. And then Sam Griffin notes in the chat, do you think that 19th century American views on nature, conquering, manipulating nature, is tied to the Indian Island Massacre too? Conquering nature through cutting down the redwoods in the indigenous population living amongst nature, not conquering, but cooperating with nature. Economically too, profiting off cutting down the redwoods, whereas the indigenous population didn't want to use nature for economic purposes. Is it possible all correlated with the Anglo-American superiority rhetoric in the 19th and early 20th century? A big question from Sam. A lot to think about. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, absolutely. I think that all of those things are interconnected. So much of the rhetoric of, what we common, I guess, just kind of put under the umbrella of manifest destiny, or even, in the 19th century, what was at that time deemed as progress, was deemed as improving the land, was cutting down trees, was agriculture, was driving in livestock. And I actually, in the book and in the introduction, I kind of make it an explicit statement that the conquest of land and the conquest of people are completely interrelated. They go hand in hand. So yeah, I would definitely say that those things are absolutely tied together.
Thanks, Michael and Sam, for the question. And Luis didn't have a question, but just grateful for putting the thesis at the forefront of the introduction. And Luis is still working on that. I think I like that too. I love these book talks, especially the dissertation to book, because often the book talk is a kind of master class in historical research methodology. And I thought I agree with Luis. I was grateful for the clarity of putting these ideas forward so crisply, so neatly. And on that sort of big picture question, Gabrielle Cervantes asks, what inspired you to write your book? We heard a little bit about that in the introduction, but we heard a little bit about the sort of genesis of the project, but just an opportunity to add anything to Gabrielle's question if you'd like.
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, I guess one thing that's kind of odd about me is that wherever I've lived, I've become interested in the history of that place. And so actually the very first thing that I ever published was from a seminar paper I wrote on recent African American history. And so it's an article actually about related to public housing issues and a rent strike that took place in the late 1960s in St. Louis. And I got just super interested in it and was able to have it become a published article. Um, Part of my interest, I think, just stemmed from having lived in Humboldt County, and it was a place that was a home for me for a time. And then the work I'm working on, the next book project I'm working on now, is related to Coachella Valley history. Like one of the things that love about being a Western historian and living in the West, is that I can kind of just jump into those histories. And I think the other piece of it as well is just that a lot of the history hadn't been as explored, right? It felt like an important story to tell. So that was definitely another piece of it.
Thanks, Michael. Must be nice, says the China historian. Uh, but to for me as a China historian to have to take a
Yeah.
15-hour flight to, but no, I actually think this is really great and an excellent point in terms of drawing on the community that you find yourself in to do this kind of to take all your sophisticated training and bring it to bear on the local context. And I am envious. But I think this is brilliant. Raquel Montes asks, is there anything interesting you discovered during your research that you were not able to add into the book?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, there definitely is. The original dissertation was too long, and so a lot of stuff did have to get cut. One of them was it's in the book a little bit. There was this effort to turn Catalina Island into a reservation, and it was something that was pushed by Humboldt, like white people in Humboldt County, because they wanted to forcibly remove all indigenous people, and they thought that Catalina Island could be a place for them. I had a lot more on that in the book and kind of had to cut it down to a couple pages, and some very long footnotes because there's a lot of research that went into it. So that was a piece of it. Some other stuff that was that would have been nice to include in the book. I had a lot more discussion in the book about the ecology of the redwood forest, and it would have been nice to include that, but again, was just had to cut stuff. So that was a section that had to go. And then another thing as well, and it's related, I think, maybe to Dr. Robinson had a question about kind of how's it being received in Humboldt County, any pushback. One of the things that I had wanted to have sort of in the conclusion, but didn't, is that there are a set of what's just called the WIOT history papers. They're housed at Cal Poly Humboldt, and they were provided by persons in the Humboldt County Historical Society, and they are letters between WIOT tribal leaders in the early 20th century, and they're in a someone has them privately. I don't know who that person is, and it was not revealed by the person that donated them, but they purportedly have the names of everyone that participated in the Indian Island Massacre. But the person that holds those papers will not give that particular letter to the collection. Um, and I think that it really drives home how this history is still deeply affecting the community up there. I also think it disturbingly highlights how settler colonialism is ongoing. That there's a white person in Humboldt County who knows who perpetrated this massacre and is unwilling to reveal those names today. There's, three people that we do know from available evidence that participated, but there's 6 to 9 others that are listed in those letters. So I don't know if I haven't received any direct idea about the reception, Dr. Robinson, but I know that I expect it because I've also seen just in online forums, people still have very strong ideas about some of this history up there for sure. Um, will there be a part two and further detail on the research not included? I recently did a trip to Catalina Island. Oh yeah. I'm happy, by the way, for anybody, if you have questions, want to know more about research stuff or anything else, you can feel free to reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat. You can also find it online. But if there are specific questions you want to chat about, like research stuff on Catalina Island, please let me know.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, and everybody, yeah, everybody can find Professor Karp's email and also the book details here at this link. I had a similar idea to, or a similar sort of question to Professor Robinson's, just in terms of being you used the phrase rank outsider, and I was thinking of sort of airing dirty laundry in this kind of sense. In terms of the educational trends of Florida and Texas, we see a kind of anxiety about telling these sort of histories. Um, but Mark beat me to the question. That was what I was very interested in as well. I've just been up to, like Yvonne, I was also in one of these regions. I drove up north a couple of weeks ago, and you see these big billboards for, Confederate military conventions.
Yeah.
It's a big state. Um, there was one more here from Luis, and then I'd also want to move toward wrapping up, maybe at the top of the hour, if that's okay with Michael. But
Yeah.
and I'm open to continuing if you like. But Luis asks, I noticed you spoke about the coal mining in Colorado. Do you think your personal history motivated you or inspired you to write about another dangerous workspace? I may have missed this during the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. I appreciate the question. Yeah, absolutely. Thomas Andrews' book "Killing for Coal" spoke to me on a ton of different levels because of a family history of Colorado coal miners. And it did definitely. It got me interested in the labor history, about those kind of workscape type connections. It was a huge part of it for sure. Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Luis.
Thanks, Michael. Can you, as long as things are winding down here, can you give us a little bit more of your ongoing current research? What Yvonne asked about sequels in Catalina Island, but you are currently working on Coachella Valley local history here. Can you talk just for a minute or so about that work and what's coming next?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am I know we can wrap up at one, but I am happy to stay on if other people have questions and Professor Murray, please feel free to hop off as well. Yeah, so actually I need to update my faculty profile thing because I had started looking at a broader sort of environmental history of the Coachella Valley. It has narrowed down to I'm actually going to be working on a book on the date palm industry out here. Which sort of started off as a rabbit hole type of thing with that initial project. But what I have given a couple conference papers about, and I'm going to be looking at, is how the date palm industry, so like dates you eat, are really tied to global imperialism because what how the dates got here were these guys that called themselves agricultural explorers who worked for the U.S. federal government, and they scoured the globe for botanical knowledge, and for potential crops. And they ended up going to French occupied Algeria, and other places as well, and were frequently shot at and tried to be run out, and took date palm offshoots and shipped them back to the United States. And, and because there were some potential issues with contamination, they ended up having to, the U.S. Department of Agriculture told them they couldn't have them in any state that had date palms because they didn't want to infect them. And so they circumvented this by putting them on Indian reservations because they're not states. And they relied on indigenous labor to get these date palm offshoots to thrive. And once they're going, then transfer them to the Coachella Valley, where they have become a huge part of the history, definitely a huge part of the economy. I think it's well over 90% of all dates grown in the United States come from the Coachella Valley. So anyway, it's gonna be looking at kind of continuing on some of the same themes, looking at labor, looking at settler colonialism, looking at these global linkages. Um, and I was still planning on doing a bigger project, but I actually had a meeting with an editor at a press who's interested in it, and he said, "No, like just do the dates. That'd be awesome." So I said, "Okay, that'll work." So that's kind of where I'm headed next.
It really is a master class. In a number of ways, this sort of limiting the topic is such good advice, I think, for our students as well. we have these big ideas, and then it's good. That's good counsel. Focus on the dates. I love the event-based history. I remember my advisors in grad school saying, "Oh, this is old-fashioned, but we're going to do an event seminar." And so we spent 10 months researching and writing papers on events that we chose. Um, and I think the reason it's old-fashioned is maybe you're looking at a sort of unitary kind of causality, or a sort of a simple perspective. But taking those three events as you did, and tying them together, is a real, I think, yeah, a real masterclass in the creativity that can go into the sort of the craft of history. So I'm excited to read the book. I'm excited to learn more from this work, again, about the state that we live in here in California. This is very, very rich work. Um, I'm going to wrap up from my part, and if others are going to stay on, to pick your brain some more, Michael, please, everybody noted, Michael, Professor Karp offered his time, but we can also wrap up if this is a natural stopping point.
Sounds good. Thank you again so much for all your support, Professor Murray. Greatly appreciate it.
This is really great. We have some copies of the book, and some lucky folks will be hearing from us. Uh, that's that'll be in the coming days, I think, right, Michael?
Yeah, yep, I will follow up. I'm also going to send to everybody who's here the uh, discount code because the book is obscenely expensive. So I'll send you a 40% off to everybody that was here. So, and then I'll check to see who RSVP to send along those as well.
And we have ebook, hopefully, situation in the works with our library. At least I heard some good murmurings over there. So
Okay, terrific. Very cool. Very cool. That's exciting.
thank you so much, Michael.
All right.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you all. And again, if any other questions, happy to take them. But I also know it's been an hour, so no worries if everybody's all good.
I'm about to head out, but I just want to say you did a fantastic job, Prophet. I'm actually reading the book right now. I borrowed it from another CSU library, and I read the intro, the conclusion, and I'm just gonna start going through the chapters. But like I said, that beginning part where it just tells you this is what the book is gonna be about, lifesaver. Because I was already, as soon as I read that, I already knew what to look for.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Luis, and thanks for being here.
Of
And I
course.
I'll look forward to catching up with you. Thursday should work too, by the way. So I'll shoot you an email.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Good. I got a haircut appointment tomorrow, but anytime after that,
Okay.
just let me know the times.
All right, sounds good.
All right, bye.
Thank you, Professor Fallon. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And thanks for your comment as well in the chat. I'm gonna follow up with you about that. Thank you.
I actually did have a question for you, Professor. Um, was there anything that you found in your research or just during the writing process, um, on a more introspective level that kind of challenged you maybe in what you maybe thought originally about the area or kind of confirmed something you believed or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's definitely a lot of challenges with the topics themselves, I guess. I mean, one of the things about working on a project like this for years is that it's a very ugly history. So it like honestly, it was a bummer thing to think about for a decade. And so I guess on the introspective things of it being challenging, trying to grapple with why people did these things to each other was a real challenge. Um, it definitely changed the way I look at the region itself as well, right? The place that I went to college. Humboldt does to me have a sort of eerie, weird feeling in itself. I don't know yeah, like if you've ever go to the Redwood Forest, that it really is kind of it's a unique place. And I don't know if I've sort of have like over manifested that in my mind and working on this project for so long. about the sort of introspective feeling of the place, but those were just dealing with the violence of it all was hard on the research level for sure. I don't know if that completely answers your question, Raquel, if that's exactly what you're after. Um, as far as like how and why the things happened, I mean, the one that still is hard to wrap my mind around, I actually even had somebody at a conference say that they didn't think that what I was saying could be true, was that campaign to kill Native people living in white households because there's some like brutal accounts of them killing children and women and things like this. Um, I had someone at a conference kind of push back and say like those stories don't sound like they could be real because they were like so bad. Um, and kind of went back and re-looked at the sources and the argument for that and stuff. But that person's comment stuck with me because it was not something I expected to find as a cause of the massacre, that they would have these people who were pushing back against the enslavement of indigenous peoples so that because they thought they needed to kill them. Like that was a level of brutality and a cause I did not expect to find when I started out with the project.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know if that's what you were,
Yeah.
if that's specifically a type of thing you were curious
Yeah,
about.
yeah, definitely. I mean, it reminds I just recently saw that movie Nuremberg. Um, and it kind of reminded me that comment reminded me of the psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, I think his name was. And he's getting to know Hermann Göring, who is second in command to Hitler. Um, and what he realized was that the Nazis are not that different from everybody else. They're just their prejudices really was the only thing that made them different. They're humans capable of atrocities, I think, and that's kind of what the I took from the movie. But I mean, I think
Yeah.
you see that echoed throughout most of human history is people committing atrocities against other people. Um,
Right, right. Yeah, no, thank you for that was a great example. I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at with it, which is something that's pretty common in people who study genocide, is that like historically, and also too, if you look at the psychological studies that have been done on how people participate in genocide or how they become complicit in it, the very disturbing reality is that 9 out of 10 people, if they were those people in those contexts, would have done what historical actors did, right? So I think that's a real challenging, hard thing to swallow. But I think it also hopefully kind of drives home the importance of research like mine and countless other people who study these types of things, is that we have to try to be aware of those things so that they don't ever happen again.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate it. Congratulations
Yeah,
on your book. I'm so excited for you. That's great to hear.
thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for making it. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Any other questions, anybody? Okay. Well, thank you all again. And wonderful to see again, family and also familiar names here. Really appreciate it, all the support over the years. And yeah, just thanks for being here. And hopefully I'll connect with you all sometime soon. Take care. Thanks, Andrew. Take care.